In May 1993, Marseille became the first French team to win the Champions League, beating Fabio Capello's Milan 1-0 at a packed Olympiastadion, courtesy of a Basile Boli header just before half-time. The celebrations on the streets of Munich and back home were typically extravagant. Raymond Goethel's side had completed an historic double, having secured the Ligue title a week earlier. The Marseille fans in the stadium were delirious, and those back home celebrated into the night in the south of France. But things soon changed. It emerged shortly after that Marseille, in their 1-0 win over Valenciennes in the final day of the Ligue season, had bribed opposition players to ensure the victory. It would be hard to imagine a greater football scandal, wrote Nick Bidwell for The Independent in July of 1993. Marseille are France's biggest, best supported and most successful club, and their president, Bernard Tapie, one of the country's most flamboyant figures, who'd taken over the club in 1986, was at the centre of the scandal. He was determined not to watch his team repeat their near misses of previous years. They'd lost the 1991 European Cup final on penalties to Red Star Belgrade, with several players unavailable due to injury. Though Marseille had put together a run of 4 successive Ligue titles, Tapie refused to leave anything to chance. He was so driven to succeed that he was willing to do anything, including match fixing. The allegations began with Valenciennes midfielder Christophe Robert, who claimed Marseille player Jean-Jacques and general manager Jean-Pierre had offered him 250,000 francs to throw the match. An envelope containing the money was discovered, buried in Robert's aunt's back garden. Jacques Glossman and Jorge Burruchaga of Valenciennes were presented with the same offer too. Now, there'd been suspicion during the game when Robert was substituted after just 23 minutes with a supposed injury. Burruchaga, who had a reputation for disputing every contentious decision with the referee, was oddly subdued. Glossman, meanwhile, seemed more determined than ever, charging around the pitch with a steely look on his face. He had refused the bribe, the only player to turn down Marseille's offer. He'd even told Valenciennes manager Boro Primorac what was happening at half-time. Glossman's vocal opposition to Marseille's scandalous approach later earned him the FIFA Fair Play Award in 1995. Immediately after Robert's money was found, Marseille's headquarters were raided. The players had headed to the Pyrenees for a training camp, but 12 were taken away for questioning. Tapie and Edeli were imprisoned, charged with active corruption, while Robert, Bern and Burruchaga were handed suspended sentences. The court case against those involved dragged on until 1995 though, and it was in the Valenciennes courtroom that the finer details of the scandal came to light. According to the New York Times report of the case, Edeli revealed that he'd been promised a reduced ban from football if he agreed to testify that Tapie instigated the bribes. Until then, the former midfielder had not accused Marseille's owner, but he insisted he was tired of hearing other people tell lies. "It's time to tell the truth," he said. And that, eventually, is what happened. Edeli spoke of the moment plans to fix the match had begun. Bernard Tapie said to us, "It's imperative that you get in touch with your former Nantes teammates at Valenciennes. We don't want them acting like idiots and breaking us before the final with Milan." The result of a drawn-out trial was a lifetime ban from football for Tapie and Bern. The former was forced to resign as Marseille's president, ending an 8-year hegemony, having been exposed in the most humiliating circumstances. Tapie's dream of taking Marseille to the top of European football, and in the process furthering his business and political career, had briefly been fulfilled. But he was brought crashing back down to earth. Now, he'd invested huge sums of money in the project and expected it to be a success, as with almost all of his other ventures. Tapie's reputation had been built on rescuing ailing companies and taking them into the black. Before Marseille, he owned cycling team La Viclaire and had a brief tenure as Minister of Urban Affairs in François Mitterrand's government. He clearly considered himself a man of many talents too, appearing in a stage production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest during an unexpected sojourn into acting. The Marseille scandal, by the end, had played out like the most unpredictable of dramas. Tapie proved himself quite a character during his 8 years with the club. He's convincing because his stories always contain a grain of truth, just enough to make them plausible, said French journalist Christophe Boucher. I think he also comes to believe them himself. Any stories told in the court, though, were not plausible. Marseille, in the aftermath of the scandal, were relegated to the second division and stripped of their Ligue title. It was the end of a period of domination under Tapi that didn't look like ending, until it did, abruptly and ignominiously. In turn, it led to further accusations from other clubs, who felt they too had been on the receiving end of match fixing. CSKA Moscow's coach Gennady Kostelyev claimed he'd been offered a bribe ahead of a 1992-93 Champions League group stage game, but later withdrew the allegation. Rangers' Mark Haitley also publicly revealed that Marseille had tried to persuade him not to play with a bribe before the two sides met in the Champions League. And in 2006, Haitley wrote in his book, Je ne joue plus, that he and other Marseille players had been given doping injections ahead of the final against Milan. Tony Cascarino, who would play for the club between 94 and 97, told L'Équipe many years later that he was regularly injected in the back before games. None of these allegations were proved, but the implication, clearly, is that the infamous Valenciennes game was not a one-off. Arsène Wenger was manager of Monaco at the time, and he recognised that Marseille's success was probably not entirely legitimate. You hear rumours, and after that, you cannot come out in the press and say, "This game was not regular," he told The Guardian in 2013. You must prove what you say. To come out is difficult, it's very difficult to prove it. But there are little incidents added to one another. In the end, there is no coincidence. Tapi's willingness to bribe and cheat led to questions about his connections in political circles too. France at the time was beset by scandals and corruption, and Marseille's triumph in the Champions League seemed to alleviate some of the cynicism around the country. But then the allegations came out. There have been so many scandals in the last 2 years that people are getting inured to it, just like traffic jams. Alain Duhamel, a political scientist, told the Washington Post in 1993. People were already cynical about politics, but soccer was considered a sanctified domain. So, in the end, justice was done, but it was far from the last incident of match fixing to besmirch football. It left an indelible mark on Marseille too. The side of 92-93 was outstanding. Fabien Barthez started in goal, Bolly operated as a sweeper just in front of him, and Goethals had a spine comprising Marcel Desailly, Didier Deschamps, Alain Boksic and Rudi Völler. The brilliant three-time African Footballer of the Year, Abedi Pella, completed the front three. It was, despite the controversy, a magnificent group of footballers. But, unfortunately, one which would have its finest moments sullied and stolen away by their owners' greed and immorality.